now we know that it's a biological condition, and there's changes in the brain that occur that are linked to people developing addictions. There's genetic predispositions for addiction. So every time someone eats something that has sugar in it, it can release dopamine. And this then kind of kicks off this cascade of events in the brain and other parts of the brain that lead to changes in the receptor binding, lead to changes in the gene expression for dopamine and for the receptors. I think it's one of the biggest threats to public health right now is, the fact that we're raising up this generation of children that are hooked on sugar.
So tell me, you mentioned the genetic link. What does that mean? So are these DNA changes? Like what is being passed down in the trait of addiction? Welcome back to the Uncover Your Eyes podcast, a podcast where we challenge what you've been told in healthcare. I'm your host, Dr. Meenal Agarwal, and today we're going to talk about something that is long overdue and probably my favorite topic. We're talking about one of the most widely consumed and misunderstood substances on the planet, sugar. And as most of you know, I truly believe that sugar is one of the root causes of many of our problems. North America has the highest obesity rate. 1 in 3 children and 2 in 5 adults are considered obese, and the global rise in metabolic, mental health, and inflammatory diseases all seem to share a common thread: sugar. But is it just a harmless treat, or is it something far more addictive? My guest today, Dr. Nicole Avena, is a neuroscientist, a health psychology professor, and the author of Sugarless. Let's uncover the science of sugar and what it's doing to your health, your mental health, and your children. Welcome, Nicole. Thank you so much for being on today. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So tell me, when I look at, what you do, I mean, it's confusing to me. I'm like, how do you study the neuroscience of addiction? What does that mean even?
Well, it's interesting. I got into this quite a few years ago, back when I was in grad school at Princeton. This is going back like 20 years ago. And back then, addiction was still in many cases believed to be a moral failing. It was believed to be something that people had control over, and they didn't have the willpower to manage their addictions and things like that. And we've advanced so much in terms of our understanding of the brain and the neuroscience about addiction that now we know that it's a biological condition, and there's changes in the brain that occur that are linked to people developing addictions. There's genetic predispositions for addictions. So for us to study it, it's been really exciting because we've seen so many advances in the past 20 years. And a lot of it has just come from technology where we can look at the brain, we can understand neurotransmitters and how they work. And really just how does this explain, some of the issues that come up when people develop addictions, and how can we help them?
So tell me, you mentioned the genetic link. What does that mean? So are these DNA changes? Like what is being passed down in the trait of addiction?
Yeah, it's really been interesting, I think, to look at that literature over the past few years, especially because there's been a lot of advanced studies that have come out that have been able to help us to understand that, people are born with certain genetic propensities to develop addictions. And often that has to do with alterations in their dopamine system. And those can be passed down, from generation to generation. We've kind of known through the years that there seems to be this inherent sort of vulnerability for children who maybe have parents who struggled with addiction to they themselves develop an addiction. But now we've been able to really pinpoint, what that vulnerability is. And I think it can be very useful and powerful because, we have the ability to screen for these genes. And so if you know that you have this, genetic propensity, then that can help to maybe make different decisions or just be aware of the fact that you might be at risk more so than somebody who doesn't have that genetic propensity.
And is this an addiction to anything? Like you won't know what you're addicted to, but it's a general addiction kind of trait? Or is this you will know, you're more addicted to drugs or you're more addicted to alcohol or sugar?
Yeah, it's interesting. There does seem to be a lot of overlap amongst the different types of addictions that develop. And I don't really think we're at the point where we can dissociate specific types of addictions that people are going to be maybe inherently more at risk of developing. It seems to be more of an addiction in general. And that can take many forms. And, we see this happening in the substance use world where, if people have developed an addiction to, let's say, alcohol, and they are able to make the necessary changes to, distance themselves from alcohol, it might be the case that they maybe start to overeat, and perhaps now they've developed a food addiction. So they can replace their addiction with maybe another addiction that perhaps doesn't have the same ramifications. And so I think that it really does boil down to understanding how addictions in general affect our brain reward system, and where we derive those rewards is important. Some might argue that, well, maybe having a food addiction is better than having an alcohol addiction, but I guess it really
Right.
depends on the degree to which, you have each of those addictions and what medical complications perhaps arise as a result.
So I'm assuming whether it's an addiction with alcohol or whether it's an addiction with sugar, the process, the neuro process is similar. Yes?
It is, yeah. So that's actually how we really got started doing this research. So when I was first interested in this, like I said, back when I was a grad student, we were interested in understanding whether or not there was a such thing as food addiction. People were sort of talking about how, if they were trying to lose weight, they were craving sugars and sweets, and that made it, difficult. But there really weren't any empirical studies to assess whether or not food, sugar in particular, could be an actual addictive substance. And so that's where we started to look at the substance use literature, the alcohol abuse literature, and really just ask the question, okay, well, if we were to replicate this study that was done in alcohol, but instead of using alcohol, we use sugar, will we get the same findings? And so that's essentially what we did. Was we started off at first using our rat models, laboratory rats, mice and rats, and just basically just started trying to replicate studies that were done in drugs and alcohol, but see if they could produce the same results when we use sugar. And that's what we were able to ultimately see.
And what are these neural processes? What is happening in the brain? Like there are surges, in certain neurotransmitters, chemicals. What is happening exactly? The kind of neuro process of this.
Well, we've really kind of dialed in on the dopamine system. And I hate to bring it all to dopamine because there's so many other neurotransmitter systems that are involved that play important roles. But in terms of what we've been looking at specifically, it has been the dopamine system. And that dopamine system is involved with reward and reinforcement. And what we see when it comes to addiction and when it comes to overconsumption of sugar and sugar addiction too, is that dopamine is repeatedly released upon consumption of these substances or use of these substances, including sugar. So every time someone eats something that has sugar in it, it can release dopamine. And this then kind of kicks off this cascade of events in the brain and other parts of the brain that lead to changes in the receptor binding, lead to changes in the gene expression for dopamine and for the receptors that lead to greater sensitivity of those receptors and lead to alterations in other neurochemicals like opioids, for example, that basically set up this situation where somebody develops what we colloquially refer to as an addiction. They'll de- develop a situation where they'll get tolerance, they'll binge on the substance when it's available. If they try to distance themselves from it, they might experience withdrawal or cravings. And then those cravings ultimately can lead to somebody using it again. And so that's essentially what seems to be happening in the brain. We have this really like a spiral of distress that people have talked about where, people will use substances at first because it provides them with pleasure, right? It makes them feel good, but
Yeah.
at some point it shifts. And, we call this the opponent process theory in the addiction world, where you're no longer using the substance to get high or to feel good. You're actually using the substance just so you feel better than being bad, better than withdrawal, better than this sort of negative state that can emerge when someone's constantly using or repeatedly using a substance.
What are these sugars? When we talk about sugar, like I'm talking, there's the sugar of eating the fruit, versus the processed food sugars. So are there specific sugars that you guys have been testing, or is it just sugar in general? So, which one would be more addictive and why?
Right. Great question, because there are so many different sugars out there, right? I mean, like you said about fruit sugar, that is in a very different category than the sugars that we've been studying. And so we're looking at those highly processed sugars, the sugars that, you know, basically the white stuff, right? The stuff that you're adding to your coffee, or the stuff that the food companies are putting into products to make them taste better and to, mask some of the off-putting flavors that are in those products that are required in order to have them be shelf stable and to be so highly processed. There's so many sweeteners that fall under this category of sugar. It's like over 200 different sweeteners at this point. And that makes it difficult because there are so many things when, if you're trying to maybe cut back on your sugar intake, it's not like you can just look at the label on the food product and say, okay, I'm not going to eat anything that has sugar as one of the ingredients. It's more complicated than that because there's agave nectar, there's fruit concentrate, like things that sound healthy, but in reality, they're actually just this very refined sugar. Now, fruit, on the other hand, like if you were to eat an apple or have a banana, that also contains sugar, but it's in a very different form and it's not processed. It contains fiber. There's, fiber within the fruit. There's other nutrients in the fruit that mitigate the effect that the sugar in the fruit really has on our body and our brain. And so, people aren't going to sit there and eat, 15 apples, but they might sit there and drink, a half a gallon of soda because the sugar in the soda is highly refined and processed and it's going to hit differently than the sugar that you're
Right.
going to get from, eating fruit. So that's why when people ask me about, oh, if I'm trying to cut back on sugar, should I avoid fruit? I always say, no, don't do that because that's really, to me, the safe sugar, because it's packaged by nature. It comes with these other things like fiber I mentioned and other nutrients that really make it a better choice if you're having a craving for something that's sweet.
So I'm assuming the artificial sweeteners all fall under this category of processed sugar. Yes.
Yes,
And
yes.
what about the natural sweeteners? They say, like you mentioned, the natural sweeteners. I want to say monk fruit probably
Mhm.
falls under the natural sweeteners. Um, are those less harmful, or would you say equally harmful?
Well, I think it depends on what harm you're trying to avoid, right? So I often will tell people if your goal is to just wean yourself off of this dependence on sugar, if you feel like you are addicted to sugar and you just want to not feel that craving and that compulsion and have that be weighing on you, then your best bet really is to cut out those artificial sweeteners and, the things like the stevia, the monk fruit, because your brain doesn't necessarily detect them differently than actual sugar. Your brain thinks it's sugar, right? You don't like have this way of detecting, oh, this is real sugar versus this is monk fruit. And so it's going to perpetuate that cycle of addiction, right? That sweet taste is what's driving the addiction like response. But if your harm that you're trying to avoid maybe has to do with blood sugar, maybe you're not, feeling like you're addicted to sugar in that sense, but you do want to minimize your sweets because it's affecting your blood sugar in a way, maybe you're pre-diabetic or trying to just manage your blood sugars, then I do think some of these other sweeteners can be a good alternative. But I think you really need to take a look at the goals. And I think one of the challenges that I think a lot of people face is they really want this sort of like golden ticket sugar or sweetener. They want this one thing that they can say, okay, you can have as much of this as you want because it's totally
I
fine to,
want that.
have it. Yeah, everybody wants that. And unfortunately, everything comes with a price tag. And, while I think there's a place for monk fruit and stevia and these alternative sweeteners that a lot of people enjoy and use, I do think we need to be mindful of the fact that it is still kind of causing us to stay hooked on that sweet taste. And I think the best bet for everyone is to really try to cut back as much as you can.
I used to have a sugar addiction, I wanna call it, because now that you're talking about this, I'm like, it was definitely an addiction, but if I didn't have sugar or that processed food for a little period of time, actually jitter slightly. And, slowly I started realizing there was that more, my anxiety would go up, and there is that mental health connection with it. So I cut back on my own, just recognizing that. But what is that connection with these mental health disorders like anxiety, depression? How is that process happening in the brain?
Yeah, there's a lot that's coming out about how sugar affects mental health in terms of research studies. And I recently wrote a book called Sugarless. And in that book, go through a lot of those different studies and talk about the relationship between sugar intake and mood, and sugar intake and, our energy levels, and how that now links to depression and even Alzheimer's disease and dementia later in life. And, I think it starts off with, just looking at our mood, right? We all know that when we have sugar, it temporarily makes us feel good. So it alters the way we feel in a good way sometimes. But we also know the opposite happens. If you go too long without it, you get that kind of sugar crash where you're now in a bad mood because you haven't had it. And so it certainly can manipulate how we feel. And I think when we kind of look at that from the standpoint of, okay, how does this maybe speak to other ways in which it's affecting our brains, our mental health? Certainly, there's a host of different ways in which it can, produce negative impacts. So focusing is a big one. A lot of people who have children or who they themselves struggle with, focusing or have ADHD, find that when they cut out the sugar, cut back on it, it can dramatically help with being able to focus on tasks and being able to not get distracted. And so it seems to play a role in sort of minimizing or, evaporating that brain fog that a lot of people experience. Also, in terms of depression and anxiety, it's the same thing. I mean, a lot of times when people are trying to manage their mental health, they'll, do the things that they're supposed to do, get therapy, they might be taking a medication or, working on it in many ways. But one way in which I really think people should focus on incorporating is to work on their nutrition and work on their diet, because it can have a significant impact on how people feel in terms of their mood. So it's really something that I think we're going to see more and more about. And I think more like functional psychiatrists are speaking up about this, and how, yeah, if you're struggling with depression, like, you need to take a look at your diet too, because what you're eating can be contributing to the way you're feeling.
So I know in your book you talked about, a 7-step plan. What kind of stuff does that entail in a plan?
Yeah, so again, the book is really meant to kind of catalog the research on sugar and how it's affecting our brain and how it's affecting our health. And, as part of that, it's really a goal to have a way in which we can help people, right? Once you learn about, oh my gosh, sugar, look at all this stuff it's doing to me, then it's like, well, okay, what can I do to, help get myself on the right track? And so I have the 7-step plan built in, really to make it, I think, more manageable for people, because it's overwhelming. And I think there's a reason why we have this diet industry that's been around for generations and continues to be around, because, all of these different programs and things that are out there, it just gets so overwhelming when people try, to say, okay, well, I'm eating too much sugar, or maybe they've been told by their doctor, oh, you need to lose a little bit of weight, you're overweight, you're at risk for a medical condition. People don't know where to start. It's just overwhelming. Our food environment is so littered with all these processed foods. And so the point of the plan was really to kind of help people take baby steps, because I think what I've learned over the years of doing work in this field is that it psychologically doesn't work to just go cold turkey and say, all right, I'm quitting all the sugar, I'm throwing it all
Yeah.
out, because it's in so many things. It's hidden everywhere. Like, you don't even know that you're eating it when you're eating it. It's like sprinkled on, frozen pizza. It's in bagels, it's in, English muffins. I mean, it's in all of these different things where you don't even expect it to be. So I think the better strategy is to really take this incremental approach. And so that's where the 7 steps come in. And, it starts off with talking about like your beverages and like looking at what you're drinking. So like, I'm a big coffee fan. And, a lot of people find that when you look at your beverages, they can be a huge source of added sugar. And that's really the very first place where you could begin to cut it out. And it's not about, just saying, okay, I'm all of a sudden never going to have sugar in my coffee, but it's maybe about, okay, if I'm used to having maybe 3 or 4 servings of sugar in my coffee, or pumps if I'm buying coffee from, a coffee shop, cut back to maybe half of that.
Right.
And, after a couple of times drinking it, you don't even miss it. You don't even realize it. It just kind of becomes your new routine. And, just really like finding ways to whittle down on the sugar intake. And that's really the goal of the steps, is to help people to do that, but on a scale that's going to be sustainable and that they'll be able to stick with.
I know you touched a little bit on, focusing. And, for me, that's key because I have 3 kids and, I have seen that my youngest is, I want to say, fits in your category of the sugar addiction. He's also my youngest. So we were just like, just take it. You're tired. With the other two, you're stricter. So he started off on sugar when he was like 3. And I can tell like there's less of that focus. But I actually went cold turkey and I was so frustrated one day. I took all the candy and I threw it out. And I feel like he's gotten so much better, and like I would never say he has a focusing issue anymore. So what is, obviously this is concerning for children, adolescents, this whole sugar addiction, that it's basically being compared to alcohol or drugs, and we are giving it to our 3 4 year olds. So what is your thought on children and this consumption, and how is it affecting their brain development?
Oh, I think it's one of the biggest threats to public health right now is, the fact that we're raising up this generation of children that are hooked on sugar. And you're right. It starts, with the products that are marketed towards kids when they're 3 and 4 years old, that, they see the cartoon characters that they like. And, that's the beginnings of it. And it just bleeds to puberty, to adolescence, to teenage years. There's this huge issue now of, teenagers, and I see it when the middle school lets out, near where I work, they like flock to these different coffee establishments and they'll buy these coffee beverages. Maybe the coffee beverages don't have coffee like caffeine in them, but they're loaded with sugar. And it's just amazing how much sugar is in these food products, and they're just freely available to kids to buy every single day. And I really think that it's like you said, it's more than just the focus. It's the fact that, kids are learning that basically they're self-medicating with these sugar rich foods. And so it's affecting their mood. It's making them irritable if they don't have it after a while. And if they're upset, or if they, aren't feeling well, or aren't, or maybe, feeling that great, what do? Maybe they'll have sugar, and that's going to make them feel better. So we're really setting them up, I think, for a future of struggles with appropriate ways to manage their mental health. Mitigating or managing it with food is certainly not a good strategy. We're also setting them up, I think, to just, we've normalized it, right? It's become so just ingrained in our culture that, oh yeah, like let the kids have a can of soda. It's a birthday party. Why not? And, go out to dinner and the kids can have soda, or like people have it in their homes. And it's just become so mainstream that people have lost sight of how much kids are consuming, and it is affecting their brain. It is affecting their ability to focus. It is affecting, the way in which they're going to have a relationship with food. And I often, will talk to parents about this, who will say, well, my kid is healthy. They don't have any, problems with obesity. They don't have diabetes. And my answer is always, that's great, but let's talk in 5 years and see what it looks like, because you're establishing these habits in your child early on, that maybe when they are in their late teens or in their early 20s and they do suddenly have issues with obesity, or they do have issues with diabetes, and they need to make those changes in their diet, they're not going to be able to. It's going to be extremely difficult because they were raised eating this stuff and drinking these beverages in this way. So I do think it's more than just, helping kids to focus. I think it's really about helping kids to better understand, like, that this is affecting their brain and the way that their brain is developing, and the way that they're going to view food from here on out. And it might not be a problem now, but I have a feeling it's going to be a big problem when they get a bit older.
And the problem is even teenagers, right? The fast click, the being able to Uber Eats, Starbucks, everything's so readily available and they think they're getting food, even with
Mhm.
Starbucks, like you said, half that pump of sugar. But they think they're just getting it so easily. So it's not as processed or it's not as sugar. It's still food like their mom would make. And so,
Right.
I think that's a big problem. Do you feel that that is what is increasing this, the rate of autism, ADHD in kids, teenagers?
I mean, I don't I think there's so many different things that are contributing to the increased rates that we're seeing for autism, for ADHD. I do think diet is one of them. I certainly do. I think we need to consider that. And, beyond that, I think we need to consider how manipulating our diet, our children's diet, could help to mitigate some of the symptoms that are seen with ADHD, with autism. And, if anything, changing a diet. I mean, I see this, all the time with families that I work with and with kids, especially for breakfast, right? If a kid has a sugary cereal for breakfast, by the time they get to school, they're bouncing off the walls and the teachers can't control them and it's disruptive to the class and no one's happy, right? But when kids have, a couple hard-boiled eggs for breakfast, completely different child. Completely different child. And again, it's about just sort of making these changes and seeing what happens in terms of behavior. I mean, if it means like hard-boiled eggs for breakfast is going to make the kid have a better day at school and make the teacher, be able to manage them better, okay, let's have eggs for breakfast. So I really think, looking at diet is so important, but it's not always the first thing that comes to people's minds. I think it's,
Yeah.
not something that we pay enough attention to. And I hate to say it, it's an easy fix, right? It's not something that, you need to do a lot of work to rectify. It's really just about like talking to a nutritionist or a doctor who can advise like, okay, here are the food swaps to make. But yeah, it can really, really have a dramatic impact when you take a look at individual kids.
Do you dream of forging your own path in optometry? OSI Group empowers optometrists to build thriving independent practices, your vision, your way. Business coaching and support, practice management software, digital solutions, and advantageous volume discounts. OSI Group is 100% member owned and proudly Canadian. Standing out doesn't mean standing alone. Join a dynamic community, fueling your success at every stage of your journey. Take the first step today at www.opto.com. Healthcare doctors, they don't talk about this. I mean, I feel now, with books like yourself, like your book, Sugarless, the trend is starting now. But
Yeah.
most doctors up until now don't talk about sugar and don't talk about diet, right? It's that quick fix. Here's the pill, right? Medicine is so
Mhm.
transactional. I have this, I'm going to give you, your pill. So what are your thoughts on why are healthcare providers not bringing this to light? Is it because they're not trained on it, there's not enough education, or it's just too much time to talk about it? Because if sugar is going to, I want to say, almost help half even as much as a pill or getting off of the sugar, why are we not talking about this? Why, diabetics don't even have counseling on nutrition or on sugar, getting off sugar, and what sugar, the different forms of sugar are. There's so many diabetics who are constantly taking artificial sweeteners,
Yeah.
constantly. And, they feel that that just replaces the sugar, but in a beneficial way. And so, their diabetes is going to go down and everything's going to be great, but they're just consuming more of it. So, what is happening with our society?
Well, I think that it's complicated. So I work at a medical school at Mount Sinai Medical School, and I'm an associate professor there. And the medical students don't get training in nutrition, right? I mean, they get trained in so many different things to become wonderful doctors, but nutrition is not a part of that. It's a very small part. I teach a lecture here and there, and really the doctors that are passionate about nutrition and lifestyle medicine go into that arm of medicine. but it needs to be something that is built into every discipline of medicine. It's not just, family care. It's also, surgical. It's, OBGYNs. It's across the board. I mean, nutrition plays a role. I really think that it's a systemic problem, and I think it kind of goes back to we haven't really updated our training of medical doctors to kind of keep up with what we've learned about what's causing people to get sick. So, yes, we learned that they have these symptoms, and here's the pill that can help with those symptoms. But what about addressing the thing that gave them the symptoms so that maybe they don't have to take the pill, right? We just kind of miss that step. And so I think that's where we're starting to see a change. And I think a lot more people are requiring that it be not just a quick fix, that it's like, let's get to the root cause of, why my kid has ADHD. Okay, let's look at this. Yeah, maybe there's a genetic component that, we can't address, but there may be some behavioral aspects that could be modified by what they're eating, or maybe because they're playing video games too long, or maybe they're doing other things that we can change their lifestyle, and that's going to help lessen the symptoms. I do think that there's more of an interest in the lifestyle component now, but it's a challenge because, again, like you said, the time, I think it's very similar where you are in Canada as what we have in the US, where if you go to the doctor, you get a very short amount of time with them in terms of face-to-face time. And there's just not enough time in the day for doctors to see all the patients that they're required to see and to treat them. And then to have that conversation around, like, okay, well, if you're, maybe going on a weight loss medication, or maybe, okay, here you need to have a prescription, because now you have diabetes. Well, let's talk about what else you're going to do besides that. Let's talk about what you're eating. Let's talk about, what are you going to have for lunch when you get home? Like, how do we set you up with a nutritionist or somebody who can maybe guide you through that? I think that part of it gets lost in the conversation. And it's unfortunate because a lot of the suffering and a lot of the medical complications that arise can be lessened if people were to change their diet. Certainly not all of it. We're not going to get rid of all
Right.
cardiovascular disease. We're not going to get rid of all high blood pressure. No. But could we put a big dent in it? Yes. And I think that's what we're going to have to see happen in medicine, because otherwise we're just headed down this road of more and more people developing these lifestyle related diseases that are expensive to manage and that are making them unhappy and their lifetime conditions. So I think that's what we need to do to make this change.
Yeah, I think I recently saw in the news there's one state, I want to say it's Texas, but I could be wrong, that has passed a law for all med schools to start offering more education on nutrition. I don't know how much, but that's a positive movement. I know there's a lot of doctors like yourself fighting, in that movement, trying to fight for the power of nutrition, I want to say, and, decreasing that processed foods from cereals and things like that. What is your take on, you probably knew this was going to come, but GLP-1s, right? There's a lot of
Yeah.
talk around that. So, that's also working on the brain, the mood process. So what is your take on that? And yeah,
Yeah, no, I think that they can be life changing for people. They can help people who struggled for many years to really redefine their relationship with food and to help them. People have used this term food noise, where basically, a lot of times I think people are addicted to food, addicted to processed food, and they're like any other addiction. That's all you think about, right? People who are addicted to alcohol basically spend their entire day thinking about when they're going to have time to drink. When are they going to be able to go home so they can have their drink, or when are they going to go to the bar so they can have a drink? It occupies your life. That's what an addiction does. It takes over. And the same can happen with food. And so a lot of people who've been struggling with obesity, who end up using these GLP-1 drugs for weight loss, find them miracles because it suddenly takes that like desire to have the food all the time away. It kind of lessens that voice of like wanting to have the food. So I think that they can be powerful tools. The problem is, just like we were talking about a moment ago, we're not also telling people how to manage their life in a post GLP-1 world, right? If they decide, okay, I don't want to take this medication for the rest of my life, or maybe I've met my weight loss goal or my health goal, and maybe I need to now not take this anymore, or maybe my insurance company isn't going to pay for it anymore. What do we do now? We have to also teach people about, portion sizes, about, if they do feel these cravings for foods, like how do they manage them? A lot of the stuff I talk about in Sugarless like applies to that, right? It's about, in addition to the medication, also teaching the lifestyle related skills so that people don't have to be on these drugs forever. Because the unfortunate reality is when people go off of these drugs, they gain the weight back right away. It's not
Right.
unlike what happens with bariatric surgery, where, yeah, people often will have weight recidivism, where, usually like a year and a half or so after the surgery. We were reading a lot about that years ago when those surgeries were very popular as mechanisms for weight loss, that, yeah, people would gain the weight back. Um, and with the GLP-1s, it's more of an vengeance. It comes back much quicker in terms of the hunger, right? As soon as you stop taking that drug, it's going to affect your satiety levels, it's going to affect your cravings, and it can come back with a vengeance. So I really think it's important that, these drugs are used in a more careful way, in the sense that they're a tool that's given in a toolbox with other things that people will be able to employ to help them, because otherwise it's just, one thing that if they lose it, then they're going to have a hard time.
Absolutely, and I think the biggest exactly what you said is the post GLP world where you haven't really gotten to the root of the problem yourself, and then you can't carry that lifestyle through. So, what are some foods that are no-nos for you? I'm never going out for lunch with you because I don't want you to stare at what I'm eating, but what are some foods that are like no-nos to you? Like that you are just like, "This is no, not happening," and you kind of, roll your eyes at them?
Well, a lot of the like processed pastries, like if you go in the like a grocery store, for example, like if we went food shopping together, I mean, the breakfast cereals, the processed pastries, like the Pop Tarts, and the basically anything that's marketed as like a quick fix for a busy mom in the morning to feed her kids, it's a no-no for me, because they're basically just traps. And I take it personally offensive because I'm a mom too. And I feel like these companies are often taking advantage of people who are in vulnerable positions, right? If you get up in the morning, you have a couple kids that need to get off to school and you have to get off to work, you know, kind of positioning these foods as, oh, here, we got you here, use this will help, it's a healthy breakfast option, when it turns out that it's really just setting your kid up for like a day of like a sugar crash. I just think that that's wrong. So those are definitely off of my list and on the sort of no list for me. um and I really think, for my family, like I really just try to get my kids to police themselves, right? Because the reality is I can't follow them around for the rest of their lives and tell them what they should or shouldn't eat. I can guide them and say, look, if you want to have some ice cream, that's great, but you need to have a small amount. You can't have the serving that they're going to give you at the ice cream parlor is this ridiculous amount. That's enough for like 3 people. Like, we need to really understand what an appropriate portion size is. Um, and so I think, it's about helping kids to understand, what's an appropriate size, what, if you have, you know, a cupcake at school because it's Susie's birthday, then when you come home, you're not having dessert. You had dessert at school already, right? So I think it's those types of things. So really, the foods that we tend to avoid are the just highly processed things. And when you look at the labels, and I've gotten my younger daughter onto this lately, it's actually kind of interesting because now she'll call it out about like all the different ingredients. And I'll now, when, it's a corn muffin, right? We somehow ended up with these corn muffins, these like prepackaged corn muffins that someone gave us. And there's like a zillion ingredients in them. And I'm like, but why do you need all those ingredients? Like, it's just, they're in there to make it such that the corn muffin will last probably for the next 10 years if you let it sit in your pantry. So really just helping, I think, to look at the food and understand, is this actually a food, or is this some like science experiment with all these ingredients that like half of which we can't pronounce? Those are the things we avoid. Those are on the no
Yeah.
list. Trying to stick to things that makes sense. And if you look at the ingredients, you're like, okay, I know what all this stuff is. Seems like I can make it at home if I really wanted to. And this might be a better option as opposed to some of these other products that are just, I don't even know anymore.
It's funny you talked about the ice cream because I whenever I take my kids out, I always secretly tell the person who we're buying the ice cream from, like, "Hey, can you split it in 3 cups?"
Mhm.
And they look at me like I'm a weirdo, and
Yes.
I'm like, "No, I want you to split in 3 cups." And I think they think I'm trying to be cheap, and so I'm like, "I'll even pay for the extra cup, whatever you need
Yeah.
to do. Keep the portion the same, but just split it in 3 cups." And I think that's so important because I secretly say it to them. And so my kids now think that that's the normal portion size. They don't see a
Right.
bigger size. But yeah, even myself, if I take an ice cream, I'm going to eat the whole thing. It's yummy. It triggers that whole dopamine loop. I'm
Yeah.
happy. So I'm going to keep eating it. It's a vicious cycle. So knowing mentally that it's a smaller portion is a huge win, game changer for us.
Well, and too, just going back to the ice cream, because there's this place near us that is like a popular like ice cream place. We're on our vacation now, so we're at the beach, and the they purposely will not give you a small ice cream because they want it to be like, oh wow, that place gives huge ice creams. Like, so all the kids always want to go to the Big Dipper because that's where you get the huge ice cream. And even like if you ask for like a small one, they're not going to hook their customer. The customer is the kid. You're just paying for it. The customer is the kid. So if the kids get this massive ice cream cone, to them, that's this win, right? To us moms, we're like, oh my gosh, we don't need all that ice cream. But that's, I think, the mindset. And it's the same with the food industry. It's the same with many of these companies that are promoting foods and making foods for kids. It's, they're speaking to their customer who is a 5-year old, right? They're not necessarily speaking to the mom and the dad who are the ones that are paying for it and purchasing it. The customer is the person who's going to say, mommy, get me that, daddy, get me that. So I think that's where we have a little bit of a challenge, right? Because, although we like it when it's a smaller portion size, the kids don't. And that's, I think, where the education comes in, and age too. Like, I have an older daughter who, she knows like the game, right? She knows what they're doing. So as kids get older, I think that they become wise to some of these tricks and understand, why they need to be mindful of the sizes and understand how this, kind of they're being manipulated to some degree. But I think it's tough. It's tough for parents, and it's tough when kids are little.
My issue is also the breakfast cereals. My husband buys so many of them, and I'm just like, "No," and I keep throwing them out. But, I wanna I don't wanna talk all negative. What are the positive, like, great foods that you feel are great for your brain health?
Yeah, so I really think that eggs are I mean, I'm a little bit biased to eggs because I just think they're such a great food, but they're very nutritious, they're very filling, believe it or not, and I think that they could be a great alternative to breakfast in the morning, instead of those sugary cereals, because the sugary cereals are really going to wear off, and kids are going to be hungry quicker, and they're going to again have that sugar crash quicker. So something like an egg that is, higher in protein, that, has other nutrients in it, that's going to kind of provide this like level of satisfaction, I think can really be good. And so we do eat a lot of eggs here. Also, the things that we try to just balance it out, right? So, making sure we're getting, healthy fats from things like fish, for example, avocados, really trying to focus in on, making sure that we're trying to incorporate vegetables into the diet, and again, it's not always easy, right? So sometimes that means like sneaking them into a smoothie, or sometimes that means, mixing them in with a pasta dish. There's different ways in which you can kind of, get them into your family's diet. So it's all the stuff people know they're supposed to eat, right?
Right.
It's just, to me, it's not so much like, oh, eat this, but it's more of like, just don't eat the processed food and eat the stuff that makes sense, that you recognize as actual food. Like when you go to the grocery store and you point to, something and you say, oh yeah, that's a potato. Like, oh, those are carrots. Like the obvious things, right? That don't have all these ingredients. I think that's really where you got to try to focus. But again, it's hard because we've become conditioned to be busy, to be working, to, have all these activities. So cooking and taking the time to prepare food at home has in many ways become a chore. And I think that part of it we need to just change, because that's one of the easiest ways to fix this problem, is to make the time to go back to enjoying preparing food at home, and to make it such that it's not a chore, and it's just, a part of the way in which, just like we take a shower and you mow the lawn, like there's things you do just to like, be a good citizen and human, right? And I think that we've gotten so, for some reason, and I blame the food industry, because we've gotten so co-opted into thinking like, oh yeah, this, heat up this meal, it's pre-made for you, it saves time, and yeah, okay, it's okay once in a while, but we've become so reliant on that most of us are not able to cook or able to make food. And I worry about, like, the next generation of kids, like, whose parents right now aren't cooking and teaching them to cook. Like, they're not going to learn how to cook, like, or they're not going to enjoy it. They're going to look at it as a chore. And again, the Uber Eats, the DoorDash, like all of these things where it's like, oh, I'm hungry. Instead of maybe taking a half an hour to prepare dinner, I can just press a button and do something I enjoy, and then my food will just show up. That's what I'm worried about. That's where I'm like, we need to kind of go back to that, like, grandma old fashioned stuff of like, I grew up with my grandmother. So, and she spent half the day cooking, like, but
So did
it
my
was,
mom. Yeah.
she didn't mind it. And it wasn't like she was cooking dinner, but she was doing other stuff. And it was part of, like, I don't know, it seemed therapeutic to her. It didn't ever seem, I never heard her once complain about having to make dinner. Um, so yeah, I wish we could get back to that. And I wish that could become more of a way in which we look at food, because I think that would help a lot.
I think you just spoke to me. I felt like this was a counseling session because that's me. Like I'm so busy that I don't enjoy cooking. That's not my thing, and it becomes a
Mhm.
chore like you said, but a chore that gets put on the back burner. So sometimes we do reach for those, that macaroni and cheese that's in the craft dinner package. Um, you know, and or we Uber Eats it for dinner because we don't have time all the time. And I think that's a mindset shift that I've been working on for a long time now with our family, is trying to find that time or that balance, right? It doesn't have to be me always cooking. I'm like, tell my husband, you have to cook too, right? So it's that
Yeah.
balance of figuring out, where that sweet spot is. But you're so right that we're so busy, and a lot of times it's both parents now working,
Yeah.
to survive in this life now and the high prices, especially in
Yeah.
Toronto.
Oh yeah.
We have to both be working. So it's hard. Are there any like research, or is there any new breakthroughs that you feel coming out or on the horizon in the world of neuroscience or addiction?
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it's so hard to keep up. I mean, I think we've seen this boom in technology, and, people are conducting research at this like rapid fire pace lately. It's been amazing to see, and it's been amazing to see all the advances that have happened. I think really, to me, the part about addiction that I'm most excited about in terms of us learning, about how we can really better understand the vulnerability that occurs during this sort of teenage year, and how there's been a lot of work that's been coming out that really has dialed in on this window of, middle school, high school age, where kids are extremely vulnerable to developing addictions by, using drugs and alcohol at an early age, by starting using those things at an early age, and that is very much tied to the likelihood of them developing addictions later in life. And so I think that, we've always had this sort of like, oh yeah, come on kids, don't drink alcohol in high school, don't do drugs. But now, I mean, the data are so compelling that I really think we're going to start to see, more of an emphasis on educating youth about that, because their brains are not fully developed. And so, it's almost like they're premature. They're born premature, right? The brain is not fully developed. And so to then, give that brain alcohol or give it, these drugs, it's going to affect the wiring of the brain. And so it's not going to wire itself correctly. It's not going to wire itself in a healthy way. It's going to wire itself toward an addiction. So that's why I think, youth prevention programs, youth education programs are so important. And I think that, we need to do more of that, because we can avoid a lot of problems that adults face by getting kids to understand the dangers that are linked to their behaviors right now. And I think that comes with food too. I think that,
Right.
certainly drugs and alcohol it's a major issue. We want to make sure that that's being addressed, but I really think there's a space for food to be discussed in that conversation as well. Because like we were saying earlier, yeah, you might not get diabetes this year from eating all that ice cream and from not exercising, but especially if you have family history, you may find that in a couple years you're going to be struggling, and you may then wish that you didn't have this penchant for eating all these sweets that started off when you were a teen. And so helping kids to kind of get ahead of that, I think, is going to be important.
Absolutely. And it's such a struggle because it's basically, you know, sugar and understanding foods and cell phones. Those are the two things that are really changing the wiring of the brain in these teenage years. If you wanted to leave our listeners with, one sort of mindset shift or change message, what would that be?
I really think it's overwhelming. Life is overwhelming. There's so much going on. And I think, like, I'm glad you brought up, cell phones. And, you know, I actually recently started wearing a watch again, because I realized I look at my phone just to see what time it is. But then, oh, I got an email. Oh, I got this alert. So it's this like slippery slope. I think that if you make one change, it can be to the benefit of yourself. And one change can be small, but just make one small change, right? And like me with a watch, for example, like that one change actually has had a huge impact. I feel like I've hardly looked at my phone, right, compared to what it was before I was wearing the watch. So I do think that we need to like be mindful of these small changes having huge impact. And so when it comes to diet and nutrition, it's not about throwing everything in your refrigerator and pantry away because it has sugar in it, but it's about just starting small, starting with breakfast, starting with your coffee, right? Like, how can I fix this thing to not be so unhealthy? And then going from there. And I really think that's one mindset shift that can help people, because when you see a small change actually having an impact, it encourages you to then want to make more small changes, and they'll add up over time.
I love that. Starting small. It's like weight loss. When you see you've dropped a couple of pounds, you'll work harder.
Yeah,
But when you see
it's
there's no
encouraging.
shift in that scale, which has happened, then
Yeah,
you feel down on yourself. So I love
yeah.
that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today, Nicole. Can you tell our listeners where they can find you?
Yes. So if you want to learn more about our research, you can go to my website. It's drnicoleavena.com. And then you can also follow me on social at Dr. Nicole Avena, and learn about, all the different things related to nutrition and health and addiction, and really just, ways in which you can make these, again, small changes for the better.
And I encourage everyone to buy her book, Sugarless. It's awesome. So you can find it, I think, on all platforms, including
Mhm.
Amazon. So please, give it a read and start small. Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Thank you, listeners and viewers, for tuning in. If you want to catch more episodes of Uncover Your Eyes, make sure to follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and on YouTube. To learn more about me, follow me on Instagram at Dr.Meenal Agarwal. Until next time, keep those eyes uncovered.